In a kingdom rebuilt after rebellion, a scribe uncovers a hidden ledger, proving that peace was bought with betrayal. As he risks his life to expose the truth buried in ash and archives, he learns that silence can be more dangerous than fire.
Matthias Corvin had learned to read absence long before he could read the chronicle itself. The scriptorium taught its apprentices the grammar of silence, how to make a gap look like an intention, how an omitted name could be given the weight of a formal decision. It was an art that required a steady hand and the patience to allow erasure to look like purpose. It suited him. His fingers, stained at the knuckles and careful around the quill, had the small, exacting movements of a man used to correcting the world by degrees. He moved among books and ledgers as if performing an everyday sacrament. Each lay of a folio was an offering, each clipped note a prayer, said in a voice made small to avoid waking the colossus of state memory. The scriptorium occupied the old east wing of the Palace of Records, a place layered like an onion, stone older than the Reclamation, rafters blackened by the war, and desks that smelled of glue and the iron tang of ink. Windows were narrow, thick-latticed, the glass rippling like old water when the light struck it. Even at noon the rooms kept a dim and deliberate hush. Racks of rolled chronicles and bound court proceedings leaned against pillars, lumbering themselves into quiet. There were rules that governed the motion of things. When a volume was taken from its shelf, it was noted. When a passage was restored, that restoration was recorded. When a deletion was made, the rationale, security, irrelevance, expediency was to be supplied in the master's ledger. In practice, the rules were ladders and ledges, and men like Galen the scriptorium master chose which ones to climb. Galen was a small man with a face like a burned coin, dark, worn edges and an eye that had survived too many winters. He had the patient authority of someone who believed institutions were more durable than men, and that the work of keeping a state together required concessions like mortar unseen, yet binding. He had trained Matthias from child's hand to clerk's posture, had taught him the etiquette of ink and the rhetoric of omission, praising a steady line as if it were a hymn. To Galen, the chronicle was not merely a record but a foundation. To change it was to rearrange the stones beneath a city. Galen did not shout. He preferred to adjust the string on a marionette and call that governance. That morning the scriptorium aired itself of sleep in the way it always had, lamps trimmed, brushes rinsed in cold water, and the first roll of the chronicle set on the central lectern like a present. The chronicle itself was a clean thing, bound in dark leather, its title impressed in gold leaf. It had been revised and smoothed in the years since the rebellion had burned the capital. The chronicle was a public covenant, the account of loss given shape into something that allowed the new dynasty to stand with less tremor. People lined the streets on days the chronicle was read. They came to know themselves in it, to accept the story handed down with state blessing. For Matthias, the chronicle was at once work and sanctuary. He had spent his youth polishing its edges until his own reflection in the page was blurred and obedient. He had been assigned, that week, to the routine cataloguing of recently delivered ledgers, petty receipts from provincial tax collectors, inventories recorded by merchants. The small documents of commerce and obligation that made the world run on account and attention. Thomas the messenger was always late in the morning, his breath heavy from the climb over the hill, his satchel scuffed at the corners. He dropped bundles onto the table with the clumsy punctuality of someone who did not care for the sanctity of paper. "Fine morning, Master Matthias," he called, voice already losing itself in the vaulted room. From the western pens some judges' lists, and that smith in the quarter by the quay. "You look like you've been kept from sleep." Matthias made the correct motion, smile small, a rubbed thumb along a ledger's edge. He turned over the parcel and set it beneath the curtained desk where he worked, a narrow stall with a curtain that could be drawn against the eyes of visitors. In the scriptorium, privacy was a commodity reserved for certain kinds of thought. He preferred the curtain. The scribe's work was a kind of confession done without clergy. The document listened and folded itself to a man's hands. He started with the merchant's inventories. The ink was ordinary, the hands practiced and unremarkable. Names repeated like a litany: retailers, tavern keepers, Cooper's business as usual. He annotated. He marginally corrected bad numerals. He smoothed out the way some clerks had allowed layment to creep into balance. His pen, a narrow reed, moved in economies learned by early apprenticeship, a loop here, a straight spine there, as if truth might be coaxed into an orderly posture if the right strokes were applied. He read for pattern, for the governmental music that made lists into argument. It was when he shifted the final parcel, an unlabeled volume shorn of its place, that the thin, cold hitch of attention took him. The binding was not as new as the rest, its leather scored and softer, the corners singed as if some careless lamp had passed too close. It smelled faintly of coal smoke, and something else he could not name, metal, and ash, and the distant tang of burned paper. He had seen volumes with such marks before, those taken from houses that had burned, from offices looted in the rebellion's purge, things rescued and rehoused without ceremony. The scriptorium kept them, not to be read but in case their existence was useful. He frowned. There was no catalogue note, no chain entry. It had been left like a stray animal to be claimed. He drew the curtain. The world beyond the cloth dimmed, and the lamplight took on a more intimate mercy. He turned the latch and opened the ledger on his knees, as if one who prostrates himself before a small altar. Pages sighed. They were thick, coarse, and the hand that had written them was plainly not a merchant's flourish, but a clerk's brisk shorthand. Columns of names, dates, and figures marched down the leaves. Each entry had the clipped accuracy of an accountant: a name, a small payment figure, a neat line. But the dates Matthias' fingers paused ran across the months that had ended the rebellion, winter's lean, the days of smoke and mass movement. The late days before the palace had declared the victory that taught men to forget what it had cost. He read. He slowed the breath he had not realized he was taking. The lamplight warmed the page and his glasses steamed a little in the enclosed air. He read a line: Cormer of Henwell 11 Crescents 31st, 8th month. Then another: Aldarves 6 Crescents 7th, 9th month. The numbers were small, amounts that could be made to mean 1,000 ordinary things: fees, debts, wages. But they were attached, in a ledger bound for the palace, to names he half remembered from his childhood, jars of rumor his mother had spilled on winter nights. Names spoken in the hush of a household that had learned to make talk like a sealed thing. His fingers trembled the barest degree. A pencil mark, soft and human in a world of iron gall, had been made in the margin. It was not the scratch of a censor or the fussy loop of a correction. It was quick 3 words, barely legible, written in a different hand: account settled 12. Remember. The simple phrase lay like an accusation. Matthias sat very still. He had been taught to interpret the ways a document concealed itself. Here was a secret nesting not in the absence of lines, but in the care with which a ledger had been kept. The scriptorium shaped truth by omission. Here was evidence that someone had shaped it by transaction. He closed the book as if the paper would burn his fingers. Outside his curtain the world kept its rhythm. A cart clattered, a bell rang, voices rose and fell like something tied, like an indifferent. He stowed the ledger beneath the false bottom of the desk, an old precaution learned to hide contraband pamphlets and private folios from occasional searchers, and the night tightened its hing. His hand still ached from holding it. He went about the rest of his parcel with a mechanical patience, finishing the invoices, docketing entries, returning the chronicle to its lectern as if nothing had changed. Men like Galen came in on their slow feet and took the forms of law that they wanted to let pass. To him, this was the economy of survival. He had been the kind of child who listened to stories in the way a man hears a rain pattern. In his family, the account of the rebellion was circumscribed, a necessary disturbance, a brave cleansing, an eventual return to calm under a new and kind matron. His mother's recollections were roundly trimmed. Where the city had been shredded, they had sewn conceit into tidy narrative. There had been bargains, they said, things traded to keep certain families, whole quiet agreements struck in cellars, names offered and not breathlessly sold. Matthias had been told the bargain was right, humane even. It had produced their household's small arrival from the brink, a sparing of life, where less careful ones had burned on with the old ordnance. It was how they had survived. There was now in his hands a ledger that suggested otherwise. The ledger's economy suggested sale, names set alongside coins, dates that aligned grimly with the exact nights when whole bands had vanished. It was, in the ledger's plain way, evidence that some men had written survival as commerce. For a moment he felt as if he had been reading a book whose last chapter had been torn and hidden. He had been taught to believe the end had a certain shape. The ledger suggested a different ending, had been bought and catalogued under someone else's assent. He left at dusk with the ledger hidden beneath his cloak and a curl of shame at his throat. The city beyond the scriptorium smelled of coal and stew. A half-emptied street market offered the sullen brightness of oranges, the child's laughter, the clatter of a potter arranging bowls. Here and there a repaired farade bore the jag of original damage like a scar softened by time and plaster. People had reassembled life with the patient economy of those who had learned to build from rubble. A widow selling flowers might have been a nobleman before the war. The felled columns had been made into benches. A blackened archway now held a plaque that pretended not to be a wound but a triumph. As he walked the short mile to his small lodging, the ledger pressed like a small animal against his ribs. He moved through streets that carried announcements of the Chronicle's forthcoming sanctification, banners stitched with the imperial emblem, boys rehearsing the lines of the proclamation in high, excited voices. He passed a woman who had a list of names pinned to her chest like a relic, mouthing each as if it were a prayer. Her face lifted when she saw him and then fell. Perhaps she mistook the look on his. He avoided her eyes. The ledger under his coat felt heavier than any book should have. At home the hearth was small. His mother had laid out a bowl of stew and a thin slice of bread. She moved around the room with the economy of a woman who has learned to make peace from small things. "You are late," she said. Not with reproach, only a fact. "You look ill. You have been squinting over letters lately, age before time." Matthias did not meet her question. He cleared his throat like a man making himself into a familiar shape and said, "It was a day of small deliveries. Taxes and inventories. Nothing worth mention." He lied with the small, apologetic skill of men who hide heavier truths. His mother set the bowl in front of him, raised an eyebrow, a question folded into the crease of her mouth. He ate, his hands unconsciously worrying the edges of his napkin, the ledger sitting in the hollow of his upper garment like an illicit heart. That night he returned to the scriptorium by the back stair. The city was quieter now. Lamps had been lit and curtains drawn. He moved like a man returning to confess to paper rather than person, the ledger waiting beneath the false bottom as a small, coiled accusation. He drew his curtain and reopened the book. The pencil mark still held a tiny surprise of legibility. The handwriting, though hurried, carried a tilt that suggested an educated clerk, one who knew the rules of accounting and the gravity of an unguarded line. He began to copy, transcribing each name and number into a private memorandum he had made from a spare sheet, repeating each syllable as if pronouncing prayer. As he worked, the words took the shape of faces. Names that had been rumor in his youth coalesced into human particulars. A carpenter who had once taken down the mast of a soldier's boat as a favor. A woman who had delivered bread between skirmishes. A boy who had been seen once carrying water to the wounded. There were faces in the ledger, plain, rounded, lined with the small details that make a life more than an item on a ledger. The moral algebra of his apprenticeship, what to leave out and why clattered like dice now. Omission had been taught to him as an instrument of peace. These pages suggested silence had been used as currency. He read the penciled marginalia until the graphite dulled beneath his fingertip. Account settled 12. Remember, the phrase was as simple as a bell. Remember who? What? When had the act of remembering been delegated to a clerk's note? His conscience, previously a composed structure of habit and duty, began to expand into a room he had not known he carried. He realized then, with a clarity that felt almost like dizziness, that the stories told in his home had been shorn of a more complicated seam. The chronicle, he thought with a sudden cold, had the right to stand only so long as certain names were not spoken. The ledger held the knot. He did not sleep. He rose at dawn with a new kind of restlessness, the ledger secreted beneath his cloak. The city exhaled around him, market stalls opening, children running, a dog snapping at a scrap. He moved back into the scriptorium with a sense of small recklessness, as if he were someone smuggling a forbidden ingredient into a recipe everyone pretended needed none. He placed the ledger back on its shelf, under the pretense of ordinary work. He set his pen to the chronicle's margins and began to write, but the strokes were distracted. The letters trembled slightly as if resisting the ordinary peace the book sought to enforce. A man like Galen would have closed the ledger at once, returned it to its anonymity, and then reassembled the reasons why such an object was dangerous. He would have taught patience and the wisdom of not reopening old fires. But Galen, who spoke for the institution, was not the keeper of Matthias' chest. The scribe's hand, once steady, now hovered for a moment over the margin where a new note might be placed. It was a small temptation: insert a careful gloss that would protect his family. A smaller temptation still to shove the ledger under some more permanent weight and seal its quiet. He felt the gravity of those choices like a tide coming. The chapter closed on his indecision. When the day ended, he sat at his curtained desk again, the light reduced to careful pools. He read the pencil again and let the words dissolve into a single, lodged question. Who had written remember, and who was being told to forget? The scriptorium's rule of omission was not merely a craft, but a civic theology. To challenge it was to risk everything built on the back of carefully arranged amnesia. He folded the ledger closed and placed it in the hollow once more. Then, as the hour grew thin and the scriptorium emptied to its last hush, Matthias did something he had not allowed himself to do in years. He took a blank sheet and, with hands that would shake if he allowed them to show it, he wrote a single line in his small, neat hand. There is a ledger misfiled in the east wing. It contains names and sums dated to the suppression. One marginalia reads account settled 12, MC. He folded the sheet and put it into the inner pocket of his cloak. He had not yet decided for whom the note was meant. It might be proof, it might be indictment, it might be the beginning of a bargaining chip. He only knew that once he had put words to paper, he had crossed an internal threshold. The decision, like the ash that smudged the margins of the ledger's pages, would not be easily brushed away. He left the scriptorium with the small piece of paper folded against his chest, and the city laying itself out before him in a map of repairs and careful omissions. Somewhere in the palace, the chronicle sat like a sleeping beast, its edges smoothed and its history taught with the precision of a liturgy. Outside, men repaired walls with mortar and with stories. Inside him, an inconvenient truth had been prized loose and sat, like a coal that had fallen into his pocket, warm and dangerous. He could not tell, as he closed his door upon the night, whether the warmth would save or burn him. But the first ember had settled. It was only a matter of how he would carry it forward. He lay awake that night listening to the city breathe. The pencil's faint line haunted him. Account settled 12. Remember, he repeated the words until they loosened into a question that would not dissolve. For the first time since he had learned to tidy the chronicle's edges, truth felt less like a vocation and more like a demand. It wanted him to answer. He did not yet know how he would. The ledger, waiting under the false bottom, was a thing that would not be left unattended. It was ash and counting and the fragile, stubborn heartbeat of the people whose names had once been allowed to stop. He felt in his palm the ledger's small weight, and in his throat the very human, very terrible constriction of guilt. Outside, a cart rolled along the street and a dog barked. The city's night kept its ordinary noises. Inside, Matthias breathed and turned the pillow, and the misfiled volume sat like a promise beneath his bed. He had the sense, then, of standing at the edge of something both necessary and ruinous, an observation that would not soften with sleep. He would not, he knew, be able to ignore it come morning. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in a long time, felt the future take on the taste of ash. The scriptorium's world had taught him the shape of Erisha. It had not taught him how to measure the weight of a name. The ledger's pencil mark shivered in his memory as if writing itself again and again. Remember, he tried to imagine whom it addressed. He tried to imagine the consequences of remembering. He did not yet see what path he would choose. But the curve of the night had altered, and when dawn came, there would be a ledger waiting for him to look at once more. And so he slept with the knowledge that a simple penciled note could unmake the peace his family had been living in for decades. The hook, he told himself as he switched off his lamp and wrapped his cloak closer, was that nothing in the ledger could be dismissed as ordinary. It bore the tang of complicity, or at least of bargain. Whether it would be revelation or ruin he could not say. He only knew the feeling that comes when a house settles on a new foundation, a faint, continuous creak that promises collapse or reparation depending on how one learns to listen. The chapter closes on the image of Matthias with the ledger hidden and the pencil inscription haunting his sleep, and the book of the chronicle waiting, not yet sanctified. A decision waits with him, to carry the ash forward or to keep it softly buried. Matthias used to think the scriptorium taught him how to fold time. It taught him to take the raw minutes of the city, the official petitions, and the court seals, and to crease them into the tidy logic the state required. He had been taught to smooth a wrinkle into a seam and name the seam a foundation. He had been taught the names for this work: polish, excision, patient artifice. Tonight, sitting at a curtained desk beneath a lamp that threw a small territory of light over nothing else, he understood that the scriptorium did not so much teach as accrete defenses. The lamp made a battery of shadows along the aisles. Outside, the rebuilt capital breathed quietly, its breath a centuries-long exhale of coal and mortar, of women bringing back rubble into hearths and men buying new nails for old doors. He had not meant to find anything. That was the ordinary perversity of truth. It found the inattentive as much as the searching. He had come to the long table because there was method to tidying, and the practical pleasure of it calmed him. He liked to order things. Ordering was an armature for thought. The misfiled volume looked like any other at first glance: dull vellum, cord bindings, the faint ring of a wax mark half erased by time. Its edges bore the faint black bloom of smoke, a color he had come lately to associate with the city. Ash in gutters, soot on window ledges, a faint seasoning to the air. He had smelled that same breath in the mouths of those who returned from the grounds at dawn, the dust of places burned, and the iron tang of the past. It was the penciled note that drew his eye. The ledger lay open where it had been shoved between account books and a record of unfortunate land grants, its pages splayed like the hand of a sleeping creature. He had no business beyond the task he had been given to inspect, to reconcile, to sign for their receiving, but his fingers, stained in the same brown black that had engraved his family name in the work, slid along the page and stopped. The handwriting was small and tidy, the kind of clerk's hand that slept on the wrist and dreamed in marginalia. A series of names sat in a column, and beside each a date and a coin tally. The dates, the cadence of the numbers aligned with the week, that everyone in the city claimed was the end of the rebellion. He had seen those dates in other guises, in rolls of soldiers' musters, in casualty lists, in market notices of closures and curfews. They were, until now, the hygiene of municipal record-keeping. Here, though, they were married to something worse, payments. Sums listed as if they were invoices. He read one entry aloud under his breath, the voice small in the hush. Aldrich Munn, 15th 40, Golan v. 5th 40, Heller of the Dock, 1630. The names made corners in his mouth like remembered bread gone stale. He tried, the way scribes always tried, to contextualize the list into a taxonomy he could file. There were charity disbursements. There were stipends for widows. There were, in the archives, records of ransom. But the handwriting carried a deliberate anonymity, a kind of pale precision that suggested balance, not compassion. The numbers were neat as additions on a ledger sheet, not as the vague, trembling sums of relief. Between two entries, cramped into a margin that smelled faintly of smoke and repression, a penciled word caught the lamplight and felt like a stone, safety. It was not fully spelled. There were smudges, as though the hand had trembled at the thought. It sat there unadorned, a justification and nothing, safety. In the scriptorium 1,000 excuses were made for omission, peace, stability, expediency, and they were embroidered into rituals. Safety was the oldest of those stitches. He tasted the word in the back of his mouth. For a moment he could not sort what to do with it. He closed the ledger and opened it again. A line, then another, revealed the same pattern. Payments on precise dates. Names of men and women who could easily be imagined, the sort of names that made small lives and small deaths, and beside them the quiet arithmetic of coin. There was a seal, half-pressed and smudged, the impression so faint that it might have been an accident. The record bore no heading that explained its origin. It had been catalogued improperly, or worse, left to be found. The scriptorium had rules about found objects. Items were to be logged, to be turned over to the master. The rules existed not only to keep order, but to keep people from making mistakes that could ripple into the open. He had seen men disciplined for less, a line left unwritten in a chronicle, a supplication misfiled in the wrong folder, and then read aloud in the wrong company. Discipline had many faces here. Gallen's face came to him like a ledger entry, the scriptorium master with his folded hands and patient voice. He had told Matthias once, on a wet afternoon when a careless young scribe had made an error in a land titling, that truth in the archives was like a tide that could drown the living if released without counsel. "We are not merely recorders," Galen had said. "We are keepers of consequence." The words had been delivered not as doctrine but as warning. They had sat on Matthias' shoulder like a sparrow. But Galen's caution, tonight, felt small against the whole of the page. There is an odd, private arithmetic in discovery, a sum of curiosity plus fear equals action. Matthias felt the count of it in his ribs. He slid the volume beneath his coat with a motion that surprised him by its speed, as if he had practiced the gesture on some other night. He needed air. He needed a plan that was not yet thrummed into being. Outside, the city was a soft, toothless thing. The rebuilt capital often wore its scars like jewelry, whole blocks of new stone that carried the ghost lines of older walls, incongruities in mortar telling older stories. He walked the aisles between stacks with the ledger tucked under one arm, the smell of lamp oil and dust in his nose. The curtains of the scriptorium cut the room into compartments. They made sanctuary and also prisons. He found a small curtained cubicle and sat down. There was a little drawer beneath his bench that had a false bottom he had carved when he was young enough to think that small cheats could be called practicalities. It was a ridiculous thing to have made, a youth's indulgence in a life of paper. He slid the ledger into the false bottom and closed the drawer slowly. The wood made a small, assured click like the closing of a mouth. He could have left it there, or brought it at first light to Galen. He thought of his mother's hands, of her smoothing the seam of his collar, and telling him that a quiet life was a good life. He thought of his father moving through the house, without speaking of the times. That silence in his family had always